Hello YouTube! Scott here with another instant review. And once again, we're going to WandaVision, Episode 7. Now, since we're this far along and there's only 2 episodes left, let's skip the general review and just go straight to the description. I'm going to spoil a lot of stuff, obviously, but I will be providing insight as I go, I hope. Anyway, so I kind of figured that the aesthetic of this episode would be Modern Family, because it's getting closer to the present, and Modern Family is an ABC property, which is of course owned by Disney. It turns out I was right. Great. So, they got the interviews where people are talking straight to the camera, and the episode's actually called Breaking the Fourth Wall, so there you go. The storylines kind of converge, but then kind of don't. There's 3 of them. 2 of them wind up coming together in the end. Let's start with what is surprisingly the least important one, Vision's storyline. He comes to, having just almost fallen apart, trying to pull himself out of the hex, which apparently he can't do, which presumes that he can only stay alive if he's inside. And he comes to near the circus. Since he looks like Vision, the hexed, if you will, sword employees, or agents, who are now circus performers, think he's a clown. And they want him to practice with the escape artist, who, as it turns out, is Darcy. You may remember she was handcuffed to a vehicle before the hex expanded. Well, she's just standing there now wrapped in chains, which she breaks out of easily when Vision's trying to convince her that they've met before. And he eventually gets sick of trying to convince her and just wakes her up. And the 2 of them hijack a funnel cake truck, I didn't know those were a thing, and manage to make their escape. And as Darcy's driving, she explains to Vision how he died, and then came back to life, and is now part of a TV show, apparently, and then kind of died again. And even though he's Vision, he takes it remarkably well. And that's when things get a little Truman Showy, because in the middle of nowhere, they have to stop for a red light at an intersection, a completely deserted intersection, until the light turns green, and then a road crew comes up to apparently fix the broken light. And then when they get out of the way, a crossing guard shows up, and there's a bunch of kids who have to cross the road. And Vision's doing one of those interviews with the camera, and then he realizes, why am I doing this? And he blasts off. And then it cuts back to him in the vehicle, and he blasts off again, just kind of leaving Darcy to herself. The second storyline is out in the real world, where we find out that, 1, Director Hayward is a total dick. Project Cataract, the thing that Darcy found on his computer, is something that he wants to use to put Vision back together in the real world and turn him into a weapon. How exactly this is going to work properly without the Mind Stone, who knows. But now Agent Wu and Captain Rambo have that information. Not that it matters, because they're getting down to trying to re-enter the Hex. Now, there was a lot of speculation as to who Monica's astrophysicist friend is. I don't think she actually met her, because the only person she talks to when she gets there is a sword agent, I guess, called Major Goodell. And she doesn't seem familiar in any way, but she has this futuristic vehicle that they used to use for space operations that they figure will be able to get through the Hex. So Monica suits up and drives it straight into the barrier. It doesn't work. She keeps pushing and pushing and pushing, but then she realizes it isn't going to work, and the Hex is actually starting to rewrite it, to something that's more appropriate for inside. And she manages to get out before the barrier spits the thing out, and it lands on the ground, half space vehicle, half what looks like might be a minivan. And Monica realizes there's only one way she's getting in that Hex. Agent Wu realizes it too, and tries to stop her, but it's too late. She pushes herself into the barrier, and I don't know if it's because she's going in under her own power, but it's a lot harder. And she sort of separates into different versions of herself, and she can hear people's voices, her mother's, Captain Marvel's, Nick Fury's. And she comes out of it and does a pretty passable superhero landing into Westview. And when she looks up, her eyes have turned blue, and that's how you know, well, she's got powers now, because why else would her eyes have turned blue? I think before we get to the final storyline, because this is the point where the 2 of them are going to converge, let's go to the commercial. It's a medication commercial. and it's for a new medication called Nexus. There are two very important lines in this commercial that are most likely clues as to what's going on. One is talking about how Nexus will help you to be anchored to your own reality. So that seems pretty significant. And then the tagline is Nexus, because you're not the center of the universe. Or are you? Raises questions, Now, let's get to the meat of this episode. Wanda is in bed, rather depressed. It's not entirely explained why. Either she knows she can't keep Vision under her control, or she's worn out from expanding the Hex, maybe both. She wants some me time, so the twins go downstairs and they play video games. But then the next thing you know, their video games start, changing and regressing. They were playing some sort of game console that I don't remember, and before you know it, they're Atari controllers, and then they're both holding a hand of Uno cards. It just doesn't make sense. And Wanda gets up and decides she's going to have some cereal, and practically before her eyes, the cereal carton regresses through the past periods that the show's been in until it's an actual glass milk bottle. And when she thinks something might be going on, Agnes shows up, surprise, and offers to take care of the twins for her. And while she's sitting in the living room, trying to convince everybody, even the documentary crew, that she's fine, she's clearly not fine, and she doesn't know why either. And you can tell because everything around her starts changing. The TV becomes more basic, more of a 50s style, the wallpaper changes, you can watch the stairs and the table and everything, and it's a clear sign that something is going wrong. Now, this is the point where the storylines converge. Monica shows up as outside Wanda's house. Wanda comes out and she tries to tell her what Hayward is up to. She doesn't care. She says that this is going to make her look like the bad guy, and she kind of doesn't care about that either. And even when she mentions that Hayward is trying to weaponize Vision, and that's the only thing that gives Wanda even a little bit of pause, even though she's been using her powers at this point to lift Monica into the air, and when she stops, Monica does another superhero landing, so good for her. But again, that's when Agnes shows up. And Agnes talks Wanda out of listening to her and takes her to her house. Now, as you may remember, Agnes had already taken the twins to her house, and Billy, of all people, says something really interesting. He's coming into his powers, and he realizes that of all the voices he can hear, of all the thoughts, he doesn't hear anything coming from Agnes. And she just kind of gives him a look, and then it cut to the next scene. But, cut now to when Wanda is in Agnes's house. Agnes goes to make tea. Wanda looks around, realizes Yo Gabba Gabba's on the television. There's some half-eaten peanut butter sandwiches on the table. And where are the twins? And when she asks Agnes, she says, they're probably playing in the basement. Now, Wanda goes down into the basement, and this is not your typical suburban basement. It opens into what looks like a catacomb with a glowing magic book of some kind. And Agnes steps in, holding her pet rabbit. I believe his name is Senor Scratchy. And that's when she introduces herself as Agatha Harkness. And how nice it is to meet Wanda finally. And then you get a whole new opening theme that's all centered around Agatha. And there's complete with a theme song, and the font of, the title, because it's called Agatha All Along, really reminded me of the Munsters, which I absolutely loved. And you go back through all the time periods, and you see where Agatha was using her magic to mess with things, whether it was interfering with the magic show in the 60s, or mind-numbing herb or whatever, so he was trying to cut through through a solid wall in the 70s. And she's the one who brought Pietro in the 80s. There's a shot of the outside where she's sitting there controlling him while having a picnic on their front lawn for some reason. And it's literally been Agatha all along. And she caps it off right at the end, being back in the 80s aesthetic, holding the dog Sparky, remember who died, wrapped up in a blanket, looking straight on at the camera and saying, "And I killed Sparky too," before cackling like a witch. It was beautiful. I loved it. Catherine Hahn really deserved like a freaking Emmy for this episode, because that performance, just for the theme, was so perfectly over the top. It was beautiful. And this episode has the first official post-credit scene, although I'm still saying that the one in the 80s episode where, Wanda said, "Can't I?" and then the credits rolled but Vision wouldn't give up on her, should have been considered a post-credit scene, because most of the fun stuff there happened after the credits. But you get this post-credit scene where Monica is poking around outside Agnes's house, and then Pietro shows up. His eyes are kind of purpley, so you know he's being controlled by Agatha. And then by the time the episode ends, so are Monica's eyes. And the one thing that I was going to point out was that this made perfect sense, actually, to me. From the last episode, where Agatha was controlling Pietro, she didn't show up much in that episode until Vision was out on the edge of town. And she might have been there on purpose to mislead him or whatever, but I also think it's because if she was closer to the action and actually part of the show that week, Wanda would have picked up on her controlling Pietro. And clearly she was, because that has to be how Pietro knew that Vision had already died. He wouldn't have known if he was from another timeline, which, again, he might still be. Agatha might have just grabbed, like, the nearest Pietro in the timeline. And obviously, the real Pietro died. So, this is getting insane. I can't wait to see what happens. I don't think I forgot anything this time, and I'm really happy about it, except the one thing. The opening, there's an opening title, obviously, for WandaVision, and it just keeps saying Wanda in a bunch of different ways, except for one. There's one quick shot of what looks like writing clipped out of magazines and newspapers, like you're doing a ransom note, that says, "I know what you are doing, Wanda." And then, of course, like right at the end, it's like Wanda, and then Vision just slides in for the very end. But it still says created by Wanda Maximoff, so there's that. Now, there's a lot of speculation about who created the Hex, and I still think it was Wanda who did it, operating out of, her grief over losing Vision. And the clue that did it for me is when Pietro is talking to her, obviously controlled by Agatha, talking about how he's so impressed with what she did. So, it seems to me that Wanda created this whole thing. Agatha, the powerful witch, picked up on it somehow and has inserted herself into the Hex and into Wanda's life. But the question is, why? And just like you, I'm hoping to find out in episode 8. We got a little while to wait, but I think it's going to be worth it. Anyway, you know the deal. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.